Cool. Sounds good. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here today. I hope you got a lot out of the keynote speakers this morning. I know I sure did. And it was also really cool to see the behind the scenes of the podcast recording too, which was neat. But just in general, I have been really learning from and appreciating everybody. So the first thing I'm going to start out with is last night as I was editing my slides for this, I was thinking about the excellent presentation I went to yesterday morning, thinking about deficit language. And I just want to say I'm changing the title up because I don't feel like neuroatypical is necessarily the best way to put this. So this is my working title of Tips for Working with Kids with Autism and Other Neurological Differences. And I think as you'll learn too, some of these tips are just things that work with most kids in general. So I think neurodiversity is a term that we'll be talking about a lot today too. But in general, you won't hear me referring to autism as a disorder. You'll hear me referring to it as a different way of understanding and thinking about the world. And I think just in general, I would challenge us to all think about different neurological differences as being just different ways of understanding. And there are definitely things that we can do to help support those different ways of understanding in our programs, whatever they may be. I hope that you'll take away from this some tips, but also some sort of compassion for folks and just the impetus to check your own biases and to try to be a little bit more empathetic in planning your programming and not panicking when something goes a little bit differently than you might plan for it originally. So we'll get started. My plan for today, I'm going to just introduce myself a little bit, and I have a few disclaimers that I'd like to share before we start. To talk about autism a little bit specifically. This presentation will be mostly focused around kiddos with autism, but there are a lot of these tips that can be applied to other kids with other neurological differences or else other, just like I said, people, anybody. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about planning, how to communicate with families, and the benefits of that, some specific tips for making programs and activities more accessible to folks. What happens if either someone with autism or someone in general might experience like a meltdown in your program, and some tips that you could use for that. And then also, then honestly, just a catch-all for like other things you want to think about too that might not fall into those categories. And then I'm hoping we can leave some time for discussions and questions as well. And for some reason, my cat is making all sorts of noises in the background. So if you hear chattering, it's because the doves are sitting in trees. And I apologize for that. So a couple things about me. The first thing is I'm not an expert in this field, and nor do I have autism or any diagnosed neurological differences. So I just really want to honor those who do have more experience than me, both your lived experiences and then also experiences you might get from other places. So I'm an enthusiastic learner and a practitioner. I've been working in education in some form or the other for the last 18 to 20 years. And this is something that's really interesting to me and something that I feel really passionate about. So I've gone to a number of trainings and read books, but I'm not a psychologist. And even more importantly, I'm not somebody who lives this experience every day. So I do hope that we'll have time to share. If you do have things to add, feel free to throw them in the chat or questions. And I hope we can learn from each other today. My background, I'm currently the education director at Gallatin Valley Farm to School. My email is down there if you want to follow up or want to check out our website. And in this role, we work to connect kids and families with local food and agriculture through hands-on science and art and nutrition and all sorts of fun kinds of outdoor and indoor programming in the Bozeman and surrounding area. My background is in informal education and environmental studies, and in particular, I've done a lot of work with camp type programs. I've also worked in school-based programs, and my education currently is primarily in the elementary school ages. So the reason I tell you that is some of these tips and some of the examples I'll be trying to give will be coming from and informed by those particular experiences. That doesn't mean that they might not apply to your program. If you're seeing people on, through an interpretive basis, seeing people that just come in and might work with you for an hour or so at a park, or if you're working with kids in a more formal setting, some of these tips can still be applicable to you. So I hope that everybody will have a chance to learn a little bit from this. But if you're wondering why I'm talking about, hey, if you have kids that are new to your camp program a lot, that's probably because I work a lot with camp programs. But again, I'm hoping we can have some time for questions and input and sharing knowledge too. So let's jump into it. I also want to share a great resource. So this book that's here on the screen, Happiness, Diversity, Autism, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's written by a team led by Sylvia Van Meerten, and she is a woman with autism who leads camp programs, I believe, out of Michigan. She also does a lot of training. So her organization is called chasingsummer.org. If you are interested in bringing in more in-depth training into your organization, they can do staff training, they can do all sorts of good work. So I would, again, if you're looking for people who are experts with both lived and academic experience in this, they are folks that are a great resource to go to. And this book, it's $20. It supports their programs. I highly recommend buying it. And they're super nice too. Like, I got a handwritten note when I ordered it, and they were so thankful for me buying their book. So independent publisher and everything like that. So again, highly recommended that you check them out. So what is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is an approach to learning and disability that realizes that diverse neurological conditions are the result of normal variations in the human genome, which asserts that neurological differences should be recognized and respected as a social category on par with gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability status. And so one of the important things that I hope we can get out of this definition is that neurodiversity is normal. And that's why I'm moving away from that neuro-atypical category. It's not a problem, it's not a disability, although it can cause challenges in life, especially in the way that people are treated and the way that they have to interpret and work within our society. But it should be respected as a category that we try to celebrate and try to have happen in our programs. Before I move on, I'm sorry guys, I forgot to give one more disclaimer. I want to give a big shout out to Rylan Brett, who is on this call, I believe, as well. And she's one of my coworkers at Gallatin Valley Farm to School and did a lot of help with me in pulling this. And Rylan was the one who highlighted for me this definition, in addition to some other work that she did to help with the legwork for this. So thanks, Rylan. And also just in general, this is sort of, I hope, can ground us in what we're talking about today. Why is neurodiversity important? First and foremost, because neurologically different kids deserve to be included. I mean, I feel like you could full stop right there, because there's no reason that they shouldn't be included in your programs. But beyond that, neurologically different kids can get the same benefits from our programs as other kids, if not more benefits. I think about the example of a kiddo who might have a really hard time sitting in a normal classroom setting. And then they get into a field experience and they have a great time and they can really thrive because there's things that they can do that are hands-on and more stimulus for them that's tactile and an approach to a different way of thinking. So for the perspective of neurologically different kids, they deserve it and they can benefit from it. On the other hand, there's also something that we're teaching to typically developing youth if we don't include these kids in our programs. And that's that people who think act differently than them don't have a place in these experiences. And so if you're always seeing the autistic kids get taken out of your programs, or you're always seeing the kids who might have ADHD and be a little bit more wiggly being told like, oh, you can't sit in the circle with us while we're practicing our nature journals. What are you going to think about how those kids can participate in your programs in the future or participate in other things in the future. So how we do and how we set up our programs, whether intentionally or not, is teaching every kid that participates in those programs who is a part of their group and who is not a part of their group. So I think it's really important for diversity in general to try to make our groups as intentionally diverse as we can get them, because it's teaching the future generations that those people belong as a part of their society. Okay, so let's talk about autism a little bit. First of all, autism is pretty common. It's estimated by the CDC and the American Association of Pediatrics that somewhere between 1 in 68 kids and 1 in 45 kids in the US have autism. So that's one of the reasons that I chose to focus on this as our sort of case study for this session, is that you're going to run across a lot of folks that have autism. I mean, if you have a program that has 300 kids in it throughout the year, you know, look at the math, you might have up to 6 kids with autism that you're working with. So autism is a neurological difference. Again, I'm not using that word disorder, but it's a difference, and it affects how people think, how they learn, and how they communicate. You might have heard the term autism spectrum. So you can sort of think of that like, Sylvia Van Meerten gives this example of like a spectrum from somebody, this isn't for autism, but like, you know, you might be a really messy person and someone else might be a really clean person. And somewhere in the middle, there might be somebody who's like, I'm okay with some things being messy, but some things I need to be really clean about. So that's like a spectrum of your cleanliness comfort. With autism, you're almost more of a multidimensional spectrum. So you can have, it affects your sensory processing. So you might have like a kiddo who has autism who's really on the intense side of that, who for them, like lights are really, really bright and sounds are really loud and they really impact how they're thinking and doing things. Or it might be more moderate than that. It also impacts social interaction. So it might be very hard to understand social norms and to interact socially, or it might be really easy for folks. And again, on the language, they might go from being completely nonverbal to completely verbal and talking to you all the time. So it's sort of like a cube that you can picture. But in general, and that's another disclaimer, this is all in general, every single individual is different. In general, folks with autism tend to be visual learners. They tend to be literal thinkers, and sensory sensitivities, whether good or bad, tend to be common. It can be helpful in a way to think of autism as a cultural difference rather than a disorder. And so if you think about it, like if you were to just all of a sudden appear in a culture that was completely different than your own, and you didn't understand the language, and you didn't understand the social norms, and you didn't understand what were appropriate facial expressions to be making, it would be really anxiety inducing. I mean, the one way that I can sympathize with this a little bit is like when I was in university, I studied abroad in Chile. I showed up, I thought I knew Spanish for my classes. I did not know Spanish. I did not know how to ask where my luggage was. It was lost somewhere. I did not know how to buy shampoo. I was like totally lost for the first week. I have the coping skills and the ability to have gotten over that eventually. I got my luggage, I got my shampoo, I met people, I learned more Spanish, but it was really anxiety producing for the first week. So again, when we're working with folks with autism or other neurological differences, I think putting on that cap of like, what part of our culture are they not understanding and how can I help them to negotiate that is a really helpful sort of lens to look at it through. So some of the factors that can make folks who are experiencing autism have difficulties in our program is that anxiety. Like if you're constantly worried about what's going on and are you interpreting this right and are you understanding this right and what are other people going to think about you, it can be really hard to learn. It can be really hard to participate. It can be really just anxiety inducing. Another thing can be that auditory processing can be difficult. So if you're giving a bunch of directions to someone, but they're hearing a bunch of other things or seeing a bunch of other things, it can take them a while to choose what to focus on. And often, we'll talk about some tools to deal with this, but often in our programs, we're giving a ton of directions to kids verbally and expecting that if they don't get those directions, they'll get those directions. And then we subconsciously interpret that as being, well, either they weren't paying attention or they're just not smart enough to get it. When really they might just be overwhelmed with all the things that are going on in the new situation that they're in. And then another thing is that autism and some other neurological differences can cause challenges in interpreting the tone of voice and facial expressions that people have. So like, if you think about how you might like give kids that like, okay, you're on my last nerve voice, like, really guys, it's time to go outside right now. They might not understand that tone. They might not get your facial expression that you're getting. And again, it's not their fault. It's just that they're just not interpreting it that way. Again, same as if you were in another culture that might have, you know, a different way of using hand signals or using vocal inflection. Like, it can just be something that takes a while to get it. So a big tip I have for you is like, take a deep breath. If something's going not how you expect it to go, try to put yourself in their shoes and empathize a bit. Is it really a problem? Is it really something that they're doing to try to annoy you? Or are they really being bad? Or are they just not getting it? And you as the educator have the responsibility of changing your tactics so that you can make it so they can get it. So let me just check. I saw a couple of chat messages come in, and I don't know if I can actually see the chat box. Can I? There it is. I'll see if there's any questions that seem like something, or comments. Oh, thank you, you guys. Okay, so wonderful. So if you use Facebook, Autistic Typing is a great page to follow to learn from an Indigenous autistic activist. Thanks for sharing that, Rebecca. You're right. So Cassie shared that neurodivergence can be a disability due to lack of societal accommodation. And that's absolutely correct. So it can definitely cause challenges because of how we accommodate them or how we don't accommodate them. I think what I was trying to say in that is that it's not something that's like, you're not wrong. There's not something wrong with you, but I appreciate you checking my language because this is something, like I said, I'm still learning. So, and people's place on the spectrum can change according to their environment and the mood or the day too. So people could be both verbal and nonverbal, for example. Awesome. And then you're right. Neurodiversity is the presence of more than one neurotype. And neurodiverse is not proper vernacular when referring to one person. Thank you. Awesome. I love how we're all learning together. I appreciate you guys. So let's move on to some tips for making some programs accessible. And first, it starts with some planning and communication. So let's see, where's my pointer to change the slide? There we go. Before you just say, our programs are accessible to everyone, think about who your programs are accessible to. Don't set people up for failure. Think about who you can accept and support realistically. I think it's great for us to do everything that we can to support as many people as possible, but truly think about, like, do I have the staff ratio to support a one-to-one learning environment? Do we have, or can we do, do we have enough student staff ratio to say, yeah, we can devote one staff to working with this kid the whole time? And if you can't, don't promise that to a parent. Talk to the parent about what you can do and what you can't do. Would you welcome a volunteer? If the parent wants to come and work with their kid, can you welcome them and support them in that? I've been in this situation before. When we were first, I was working with a camp and we were like, we're going to make this as accessible as we possibly can. We're going to advertise it. We got a kid in and he really needed a one-to-one volunteer or one-to-one staffing kiddo ratio. And it was not a positive experience for the parents, for the kid, or for the other campers in the camp. And what we should have done was had more conversations with the parent ahead of time to understand what his needs were and to understand what we could actually provide in that program. And if you can't do it, a good idea to do is to have in mind some other programs that you could refer kids to. Get to know the other, whether it's academic programs or camp programs or things in your area. Again, this might not apply to all of you guys if you're working in school programming. A lot of kids who need one-to-one support will have a para in school. Or if you're working in interpretive programming where families come, like their families there. So again, think about what your program is and who you can support. An example that we do with our programs, our summer camps, all the kids have to use a porta potty outside. It's one of our COVID protocols because we can't go inside the buildings right now that Parks and Rec has in Bozeman. And so for both little ones, I talk to the parents of like the 4-year-olds. I talk to all the parents and I tell them, hey, if your kid can't handle going in a porta potty, here's what we can do. You can come early, we can walk through it, we can talk with them, but your kid has to be able to toilet themselves. We can't have a staff member who's helping with things like wiping because it's not something that we train or support our staff in how to do. And parents understand that and they talk through it. And I do get some parents of kids who are like, whether they're, I've had a 10-year-old who just like hates porta potties. They're just not going to do it. So their parents said, okay, we're going to find a different option for them. Totally like neurotypical kid, just didn't want to do it. I've also had parents of 4-year-olds who are like, well, they are scared of that big dark hole in the ground, so we're going to work on it. So, again, just like be upfront with people. I think that's something I've learned as I've gotten older and worked in this field more is like at the beginning, you sort of, and maybe that's not even at the beginning, but sometimes you have this tendency of like, you want to be the expert. You want to feel like you can fix everything for everybody. The parents are the expert. The kids' parents and their teachers are the experts in their kids. You're not. And you're not expected to be. And so talk to them, rely on their expertise, and have those communications before you start a program. If you can, have the kids come visit your site and see and get comfortable with it and get to know it. But then also think about where are things where you could be more flexible. So again, an example is one summer a while back, it was like right at the beginning of fidget spinners. And I had some staff who were like, fidget spinners are annoying. And I was like, okay, cool, we'll just ban them at camp this summer. Well, like, why? Why did we ban fidget spinners at camp? They're totally, in a way, were a socially acceptable tool for kids who needed to do something with their hands. Like, I can't find it right now and it's making me uncomfortable, but I have this ruler that folds in and out. And half the time I'm on a conference call, I'm fidgeting with that ruler. Why is it socially acceptable for me to do that when it's not socially acceptable for a kid to use a fidget spinner at camp? So again, what are you doing that's just the way they've always been or because of your own biases? And where could you be more flexible in that? So doing some planning is really helpful. Another thing when you're planning is to look at your intake process. So whether it's getting information from teachers for school programs or getting information from parents for out of school programming, are you asking the right questions and are you getting the information you need? Like, are you just asking about their emergency contacts or are you asking, do they experience anxiety a lot and how do you help handle that? One question I've added to forms that I really like is, and it's applicable for any kiddo, what if your kid's having a bad day, what tends to help? And it's amazing how some kids, it's like they need to play a different game. Some kids, they need to read a book. Some kids, they need one-on-one attention. And parents know that answer. We don't. And it's not our job to try to like discern what this will help this child. Like get the information from their parents or their teachers and don't be afraid to ask their advice. Also training staff, taking some time, whether it's a half day or a couple hours or more time to train them how to work with kids who experience different ways of viewing the world. Give them the tools to understand how to work with kids and how not to panic when something goes not how they're expecting it to. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but plan for some inclusion and diversity talks with program participants too. It's going to be a good learning experience for any kid. It could be something as simple as having a conversation of like, do we want to have friends that are different than us? What are some ways that we're the same? What are some ways that we're different? How have you felt when you were different in a group? How can we make people feel welcome? Having those kind of conversations with your kids, those can be great conversations for high schoolers. Those can be great conversations for 4-year-olds. So, I think just prepping kids and learning and setting that expectation. In our programs, we are kind to one another. In our programs, we celebrate differences. And modeling that for kiddos. I mentioned here too, Mindfulness practices and setups can be helpful too. We'll talk about later on about having some like quiet spaces or having tactile things for kids to work with. But in general, like mindfulness is becoming more and more of a practice in schools. So kids are more and more familiar with that, especially if you're in like, I know when I was working in Missoula, like all the elementary schools were doing mindfulness stuff, but kids are starting to learn those things. So referring to things that they're used to already can be helpful for kids because they're not having to learn something new in your program. Okay, so a few tips for working with neurodivergent kiddos. If you take only 2 things away from this whole thing today, I would love it to be for you, is to examine your own biases. So before you panic or judge a kid for what they're doing, take a deep breath and ask yourself, is this really a problem? I know for me, one of the things that I need to do this more on is when kids like don't sit still. Like if we're in a circle and they're like rolling around instead of sitting and paying attention the way I understand people paying attention. And I need to always ask myself, is this really a problem? Like maybe the rolling around is helping them to be able to focus. With COVID, it can be more difficult because they're rolling into other kiddos. And so what we've learned to do is space them out more so that if they are rolling, they're not potentially spreading germs to other kids. But is it a problem that they're not sitting crisscross applesauce? Not really. Remember too, things that work for neurodivergent thinkers often work for neurotypical group members as well. And so don't think of this as being like, oh, now I have to change everything and what's it going to be like for the other kids? Like probably these things are going to work really well for the other kids too and going to help them learn in new ways. So some of those, so this is a great diagram that I love from the Happiness, Diversity, Autism book, which is, okay, so if a kid starts going away from the group, which can be one of those things that immediately sets in panic for educators, like where are they going and why aren't they with us anymore? Before you just panic about it and yell at them, first of all, ask, what are they doing? Are they running away or are they wandering away? If they're wandering, are they interested in the activity? If they're not, why? If they are, what could you do to help keep them involved in the activity? If they're running, why are they running? So is it something where they just really like that place and they want to go to it more often? And maybe we can find some way to go to that place more often. Like maybe they love the Cottonwood Grove, or maybe they love the tomato patch. Are they running away from you? And how can we help with that? So instead of just being like, they're leaving the group, they're doing something bad, think through, why are they leaving the group? What could I do to help redirect them in a way that's going to work for everybody? Maybe they just need to run around. Like maybe they're just energetic. So maybe we could try adding running to the schedule. So, thinking about that and being flexible with it. So some helpful strategies, we'll go over 5 of them. Communicating visually, supporting transitions, giving processing time, using clear and concise language, and being aware of sensory awareness. So communicating visually, again, if kids have challenges with auditory processing, I've seen a lot of when I was doing school programs, a lot of times we'll get the kids off the bus and we have all the kids stand there and we say, okay, today we're going to go to 3 different stations. You're going to go on a wildlife hike. You're going to go and you're going to do a professor hike. And then we are going to have a chance to look for insects. Any questions? One thing that could have helped is if we had that written out on a schedule for kids so that they could see it and understand it as they go. You can also give kids a visual schedule that's like a pocket schedule for themselves. We had a kid in our fall program at Gallatin Valley Farm to School who would come, and we always wrote the schedule on the board every day, and you could tell his anxiety would decrease when he read the schedule to himself and went through it. So use visual schedules. They can be simple and they should be simple. They don't need to be like, okay, we're going to put our boots on and then we're going to put our coats on and then we're going to put our hats on. Just get ready to go outside. Totally fine. And then if you change the schedule. Instead of just being like, oh, we're not going to do that because we ran out of time. Say, okay, guys, we went really long with this activity, so we're going to move water dancing to tomorrow. And explain that visually again. Give visual choices. Give choices in general, choices that can be realistic. One of my favorites is, Okay, you have a cut on your hand. Instead of just saying, do you want to clean it off? Which they're going to be like, no. Do you want to clean it with soap and water, or do you want to clean it with hand sanitizer? Or you could show them the sink. Do you want to clean it with soap and water, or do you want to clean it with this hand sanitizer right there? 9 times out of 10, they're going to choose soap and water. So giving visual choices for that. Giving visual boundaries. Another thing we'll often do in outdoor programs is say, okay, so the boundary is that tree over there and that fence over there and that line of houses over there. Maybe consider bringing some flagging with you, bright orange flagging, and tying it onto things so kids can actually see, like, oh, I'm past the tree with the orange marker on it. Or using a water bottle, or using something so that kids, because I mean, anybody, you get into what you're doing, you're exploring, you're playing a game, you're running around, and all of a sudden you're outside the bounds, and then you did something wrong, and then that's anxiety inducing, and then you're not having fun anymore. So help them to do what they know they need to do. Another one is show examples and demonstrate while explaining. So if you're playing a game, walk it out, like, okay, you're going to run through this area, and then you tag the person. Maybe have the kids do a practice round of something, or show an example. Like if you make an art project, like take the time ahead of time to do an example. And it doesn't have to be a good example. 9 times out of 10, if it's a bad example, it's going to make the kids feel more comfortable. Like if I draw a picture of a tree, they're like, oh, that tree looks sort of like a tree I could draw. And then they'll feel more comfortable with doing it. So you don't need to do something perfect, but just give them some kind of thing so that they can see what they're supposed to be doing. And also give them an opportunity, any kid, but especially kids with autism, give them an opportunity to observe for a little bit before they participate if they want to. Like if you want to watch them playing the game for a second, totally, sure, then you can jump in. So that can be really helpful. Visual expectations. If you've got rules for something, like we teach knife skills in a lot of our programs. We have some rules for knife skills. We should use a poster that write those rules out and show the kids what they are, rather than just expecting them to remember the claw and saw. Like write the 3 rules out, or write it on a whiteboard with you. A great thing to do if you're a moving program, like if you take kids on hikes, they make small, like 12 by 8 whiteboards you can take with you to draw or show examples. They're light, they fit in a backpack. Another thing I've done, because we couldn't get those, was I took chalkboard paint and painted the back of our clipboards so I could write as a chalkboard on clipboards for kids if I needed to make a visual. So there's lots of ways to make that happen. And then if you're trying to help process an incident, like if something went wrong, don't just have this conversation with the kid like, okay, so what happened there? And what are we going to do differently? Like write it down, use a note or a drawing. To help them process those incidents and to help them understand what they're going to do next. Here's one example. Again, I don't know if I would personally choose these as the consequences, but this is an example of like a decision tree you could set up with kids. So if Nick is teasing me, I have these 2 choices. And here's what's going to happen if I do each of these choices. I could shout at him, and it's going to result in this, this, and this. Or I could ignore Nick, tell an adult, and then it results in this, this, and this. So again, these are some things that like kids who don't have challenges with visual or with auditory processing could get this explained to them. And often our default is to just explain it verbally to them. But a lot of kids just have a challenge with auditory processing. And so to help them by writing it out and giving that to them, that's going to help them learn it better. Transitions. Transitions can always be one of the hardest things to do in any program, moving from one activity to the other. They're especially hard for kids who get really into an activity, or sometimes kids who get really bored with an activity. And this is not just kids with autism, it's like anybody. I mean, if you've ever thought of an activity where you're just like really absorbed in this, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, we got to move on. I remember I was at this art museum one time on a high school trip. I think I was just really tired too. But I was like observing this art and I was having such a great time. And then they're like, okay, we're going to lunch. And I just like broke down. I was 17 years old, standing in the middle of a public place and just freaking out because I was like, I'm not ready to leave yet. So it happens to folks. First of all, give people warnings. We're leaving in 5 minutes. wrap up what you need to do, see the last thing you want to do, and then stick to those things. A lot of times as educators, what we will do is we'll say, okay, you've got about 3 more minutes left to finish your nature journals. And then you go around the room, you see that most of the kids are wrapped up with it. Some of them are asking about what they're going to do next. You're like, okay, we're done. There is going to be a kid in your program who is counting on those 3 minutes. So if you say they have 5 minutes, give them 5 minutes. If you say they have 3 minutes, give them 3 minutes. Do not shorten it down to 30 seconds. That's not fair to them. Timers are a great way to help with that. You can get little digital kitchen timers and say, okay, I'm setting a timer for 5 minutes. That's how much time we have. Teachers, if you're in a classroom, they're really good at like using their whiteboard to set timers. It's a great thing to involve teachers. Like, hey, can you give me a 3-minute timer? The timer is also helpful because then it's not you that's telling them they have to end the activity. It's the timer. Like, you're right. I also really wish we had more time to do our nature journal, but the timer's saying we got to get ready to go outside. So that can be really helpful. Another thing is during transitions, like transitions aren't always fun. A lot of times it's like getting your coat on and waiting in line. Make them fun. Sing songs while you're waiting. I had an instructor when I was working in a museum one time that like the kids, they had to move from this upstairs room down to through the museum and out to the bus. And it was like every other time it was like, be quiet while you're in the museum. Don't disturb people. Well, she made it into this like spy game where we're going to be as quiet as we can and sneak through the museum and see who can get the least, make the least sound. And all of a sudden the kids were like, they loved moving through the museum silently. So, make it fun. And then also like think about how flexible it is. Like if it's like we're doing nature journaling and then we're going to have free play, can a kid just keep journaling if they want to? Is it really a problem if they do the activity longer? So again, check your biases. I know you put a ton of thought into that schedule. You did a great job as an educator putting it together. Sometimes the kids just want to do one activity for longer. Is that a problem for you? Maybe it's not. Okay. Sorry I'm going through this so fast, guys. I just want to make sure that we move through it all. I think I got over enthusiastic when I was planning it out and put too much information in my presentation. So using clear and concise language. One thing, tell instead of asking. So a lot of times we'll say things like, hey, you want to put your coat on? And to folks who can interpret that to mean that's me as an adult who has an authority figure saying, put your coat on, that's great. But some kids can't interpret that. And they'll be like, no, I don't want to put my coat on. And that's not their fault. That's your fault for telling or asking instead of telling. If you would like kids to put their coats on, say, please put your coats on. You can still be nice about it, but don't confuse them by asking a question if you're really trying to tell them to do something. Another thing is avoid or explain metaphoric speech. So again, this is totally something that we do because we're trying to be fun, we're trying to be nice. We'll say things like, whoa, that just came out of the blue, or hey, hold your horses there. If you don't understand what that means, then you'll be really confused. Like, what horses am I supposed to hold? What blue did it come out of? Or like, give it a shot. Like, what shot am I supposed to give it? So try to think through, and I challenge you, this is a fun activity to do, is like, listen to yourself for a day, bring a little Post-it note around with you or something. And like every time you use a metaphoric or phrase, mark it down, and you will be surprised at how often you do. It's a huge part of the English language. This can also be something that can be very confusing for English as a second language learners. Metaphoric speeches and also jokes and puns and things, which we think as educators are like, ha ha ha, I'm being so funny, I'm being so like chummy with the kids. If folks don't have a good grasp of the language, it's actually alienating to them. So there was a study done in some California outdoor schools where they went through and they found that if the instructors did a lot of, made a lot of jokes during their, like if the white instructors made a lot of jokes during their nature hikes, the white kids liked the nature hikes more. The non-white kids and the English language learners did not like the nature hikes as much because they didn't understand and they didn't feel a part of the group. So try to challenge yourself to get over that bias and to use literal phrases or explain the metaphoric speech. Another thing is use short and direct explanations. So one thing I've read is that, like, if you imagine, like, I mean, I know for myself, I'm not good at computers. If something goes wrong with my computer and I have to call up tech support or like my iPhone, and then they all of a sudden start just rambling stuff off to me about what I need to do to fix it, I will get so grumpy and I'll just be like, just stop, tell me the one thing I need to do right now, and then tell me the next thing, and then tell me the next thing. Like, please don't tell me a whole string of instructions and why it's happening and all these things. So think of yourself as the tech support for folks who might have a challenge understanding social norms. You don't need to give, well, the thing about friendship is that friends sometimes do things that are different than other friends, and it's okay, but just like try to keep your explanations as short and direct as possible, and then go from there. And when you can't keep them short and direct as possible, try to use visuals if possible. So it could be writing, drawing a diagram. It could be writing something out so that somebody can read it and take some time to understand it. But again, keep in mind that folks might have a challenge with visual or with auditory processing, and also with understanding some of these unwritten norms. And so you trying to just ramble off auditorily how the unspoken norms work isn't going to be the most helpful approach to that situation. Processing time. You might have heard wait 3 seconds after asking a question, which is a challenge in and of itself. I know, for example, like if you're trying to run through a schedule, you're trying to ask kids questions, 9 times out of 10, you're going to go with one of the first 3 kids that raises their hand. What you're doing when you do that is you are biasing towards the kids who don't have a problem with the auditory processing. You're biasing towards the kids who are just like ready to go. It's not fair to the kids who really need to learn. And it's not fair to the kids who just might have to think about something more thoughtfully. And honestly, don't we want people to think about stuff? So start by counting to 3 after you ask every question. And then, sorry, my cat's on the way. Then start by counting to 5 after you ask a question. And then try to work your way up to 8. It's also good for the kids who are like the ones that raise their hand first, because they need to learn that, like, just because they're the fastest doesn't always mean you're the person who's going to answer it. And it's okay to listen to other people's opinions. So wait 8 seconds. It's a challenge, but it's worth it. Avoid stacked questions too. So a lot of times we'll think like, the kids aren't answering, I'll just keep asking questions. So like, okay, who can think of an animal that hibernates? Like an animal that might be sleeping. Like a big animal. There might be one that lives in Montana. They go into a cave in the winter. That's not helping the kids who are still trying to process that first question. Maybe they just need a little bit more time to process it. So wait the 8 seconds and really wait it. And then if you have another question after the kids have answered, then stack that question. But this all comes from a place of good intention. We're trying to help kids process, but remember that that's not always helpful. And then when possible, use visuals. Can you write the question out on a board? Can you draw a picture of something? Can you have the word hibernate out on a piece of paper? Use visuals if you can. And finally, some sensory awareness stuff. Like I said, a lot of folks with autism, but also folks in other situations can really just get overwhelmed by whether it's bright lights or an itchy tag on your collar or it's really hot. Honestly, like a lot of us, when we might be just tired or having a bad day, that can happen too. I know the other day I had this itchy sweater on, and by like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was so grumpy. And all of a sudden I decided to change into a comfy sweatshirt. And then I discovered that my sweater was what was making me grumpy. Some people don't have as much ability to cope with that. So helping kids work through that, helping them to understand to change their environment, giving them time to calm down and reach equilibrium, being sympathetic to that if it happens. And then after things calm down, after they calm down, don't try to deal with it while they're still in the itchy sweater. Help them work out to handle it the next time. Maybe give them a visual of like, if it's loud in the cafeteria, I can go to the quiet place that's near the cafeteria. And you can write that out or draw it out for them. Help them plan for alternatives, and you plan for alternatives too. Can you have some calm or quiet spaces at your program? Maybe if you need a break from what we're doing, you can go sit under the big ponderosa pine tree over there. That's okay. Anybody can go there. It's our quiet area. Have some good sensory experiences. Fidget toys, squishy balls. I had one instructor one time who figured out that if the kids were fighting and she could just give them a squishy ball, like to hold for a little bit, all of a sudden they could start to sort of work through and talk about things. Break cards or designated break area. So like I've got 2 break cards and I can use them at any point I need during the day. I'm going to give them to my instructor so that they know I'm safe. They know I'm going to go to the break area and then I can go there. And that's a good system that you can use. Another sensory toy that we've used to take into the field was take like cornstarch and some water and some food coloring, put it in a plastic bag, like a Ziploc bag, tape it closed, put it in another Ziploc bag and tape it closed. And then you can like use it to draw in and squish around and stuff like that. All sorts of things. And outside, like, again, does it matter if the kids are fidgeting with the pine needles at their feet? Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's helping them to focus and to not be like getting overwhelmed by what's going on. So again, check your own bias about things. I'm gonna just quickly talk about what happens if, and this is a term that Sylvia Van Meerten uses, a meltdown, which is basically like anybody can have them, or result of buildup in stress and anxiety. It might be something where, you've got sensory, you're wearing your uncomfortable sweater, someone's mean to you, all of a sudden you have to do something you weren't expecting to have to do that day, and then your cat knocks the milk over on the ground, and then all of a sudden you're just like, oh my God, I hate this day so much. Empathize with people. It can look many different ways. It might be yelling. It might be just shutting down. It might be being like knocking something off a table. It can be confusing and inconvenient for the people they happen to. It can be embarrassing when it happens to you. So have empathy towards folks if that happens. And it's often exacerbated, especially for kids with autism, by uninformed, well-meaning adults who are talking too much or pushing for a quick resolution. So like, if somebody's having a meltdown, that's not necessarily the time to be like, okay, let's work through this right now. What you should do is, first of all, ask yourself, is this an emergency? 9 times out of 10, it's not. If it is, if somebody's causing harm to themselves or to others, then deal with that in the way that you might activate your emergency action plan. But if it's not, take a deep breath and literally do this. Tell yourself, okay, this is not an emergency. Like, even if they're running away from you across a big field, is it an emergency? Are they running towards traffic? No, they're just running across a big field. It's not an emergency. If you can, give them some space. Remember, it's really embarrassing. It's overwhelming. It's not a situation where a person's like, yeah, I'm having a meltdown. I'm super happy with myself. Give them space to calm down. And then when you engage, have some clear choices for what they can do to re-engage. Not to talk about what happened, but to get back on. So like, hey, do you want to read a book for a little bit more, or do you want to come join us at the game? And then get them involved back with the daily schedule. And then decide about processing. First of all, is this something you need to work through them with? Or are their parents coming in 20 minutes and maybe their parents want to talk to them about it? Or maybe their teacher is there because it's a school program. Maybe you're not the person to work through this with it. But if it is, give it some time and thought and planning and help to sort of talk them through it using visuals again. Last but not least, some additional tips for working towards inclusion in your programs. Like I said before, doing some kind of a training or talk with your participants, making your schedule and guideline clear and apparent to everyone, posting them on the board, helping kids come up with personal systems if they need it. So like a break thing, like if you need a break, here is what the system is for it, so that they know and they have a routine about that. Peer buddies can be really helpful. What can be not helpful with peer buddies is if it seems like a punishment. So like, okay, Jimmy, you have to go with Catherine today. Like, instead, like, we're all going to get to know each other in our program. We're going to make some new friends. So I'm going to use these random cards to come up with who you're going to be friends with. Random systems can really help. The first camp director I ever worked under always had a deck of cards in his pocket, and he would always like use those cards to randomly buddy people up. And I'm sure sometimes he was picking it. Like he'd see like, okay, who has black cards, who has red cards? Okay, I'm going to put people with black twos together and red twos together. Like but it always seemed random to the kids. So that way you're not like the bad person who's like buddying people up in a way they don't want to be. And also like it gives kids a chance to meet new people. So, flip a coin, use birthdays, or who sleeps, if you have a dog at home or if you have a cat at home or something like that. If social issues happen, address them and explain them. Don't just be like, why we don't do that. Like, explain why you don't do that. Help people, you are an educator, help educate in these things. Perseveration is something where folks with autism can be sometimes can be fixed on a topic. So like, I really like to talk about Shrek, or I really like to talk about dinosaurs, or I really like to talk about trains. If that's a problem, if you're like, I need to do something else right now, I can't talk to you about trains right now, make a time. Like, I would love to talk to you about dinosaurs at lunch. And we can talk as much as you want about dinosaurs at lunch. And then actually make that happen. So like at lunch, be like, hey, you want to talk about dinosaurs? Help folks cope with perceived bullying. This could be like, they give an example in Happiness, Diversity, Autism of the kid who they worked with, who he was really like, insects were insects. They were not bugs. And when kids would call insects bugs, he would get really bothered by it. And he thought the kids were bullying him because of that. And so help them understand that, here's some options you have. You can ignore them. You can ask them if they want you to explain to them why bugs are not insects, or you can come and talk to an adult and partner with us to look for some insects. So like, it's and explaining the reason that they're calling them bugs isn't because they're trying to be mean to you. It's because they just don't know as much as you about insects, for instance. But then when there is real bullying happening, which can happen, even if you do training with your participants, even if you set people up for success, the best way is to be an active supervisor and participant. So the more that you're with your kids, the more that you're checking in with them, talking with them, being a good role model for them, the less situations you're going to have. And when you do have situations, you can nip them in the bud. I'm going to skip that one because we're at time, and I apologize to everybody for going over. I just guess I'm enthusiastic about this. So I hope this was helpful to you. Let's see if there's any other questions that people want to share. Rebecca, was there anything that popped up in the chat that seemed like good things to either talk about or share out with folks that we might not have just read from the chat?
Yeah, there was actually some really good traffic in the chat. I'm hoping people were able to follow that. But there is kind of a comment about how a lot of people, especially women, are kind of trained to do this indirect speaking and trying to be more direct with asking. You were talking about, asking a direct question, not doing multi-part questions, just doing one question at a time. And Emily recommended how to be a culturally responsive educator by, sorry, I'm trying to scroll down, Zaretta Hammond. Mm-hmm. Has some inclusivity tips.
Nice.
And then there's a question about, I think you actually addressed this really nicely with the Ponderosa, go sit under there, but tips for kids that need alone time, but they can't safely do that outdoors when you need line of sight with those students.
Yeah, I would recommend some kind of natural thing that's like, a big tree that everybody can see, or that picnic table over there, depending on what your setup is. But, making it clear to everybody and making it clear sort of that it's a place anybody can go to, so that you're not ostracizing kids who choose to use it necessarily. It's not just like it's Johnny's space or it's Beth's space, but, anybody could go there. But we know that the rule is like, if somebody's in there, we're going to make it a quiet space. So we're not going to go there just to like talk with each other or something like that.
Yeah. I guess I personally have kind of a comment to add to this, and that is that, diagnosis is considered to be kind of a privilege because of our healthcare system, our changing understanding of what autistic means and looks like. ADHD has only even been diagnosed since the late 80s. And at first it was just this very, very narrow idea of what it even was. 1 in 20 kids is ADHD. So it's super common, and a lot of kids aren't even recognized and diagnosed. And then there comes the point where adults realize that they have to kind of self-diagnose at some point with some of these diagnoses, and it becomes very difficult as an adult to get a diagnosis. So realize that a lot of these tips, the visual schedule and multi-part question or single part questions, can be really helpful for kids with ADHD as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, on top of that, a lot of times parents have faced discrimination in their programs, in various programs. And so even if they do have a diagnosis, they might not share that with you. And so I think just in general, like being prepared to use these things for anybody. And then you think about kids who maybe they're learning to read, or maybe they're learning the English language. They could benefit from reading things along with the schedule too. So I think it's just, like I said, good for most kids. But yeah, thanks for reminding us of that point, Rebecca.
Yeah, and then another good reminder that proper vernacular from autistic adults is, saying autistic rather than with autism, because it's something, and this is from Cassie in the chat, it's something that is a part of a person rather than something that you would have. So, yeah.
Thank you for teaching me that, Cassie. I appreciate it. Great. Well, I know I've learned a lot from everyone today too. So I really appreciate you being a part of this discussion. I hope some of the things I shared were helpful. And again, I can't recommend this book enough. And I'm sure that there's other great resources like the one from Zaretta Hammond and from other sources too. So thanks for caring about this and being a part of our conversation today. Okay, I guess that's it.